We're going to be reading from Hebrews 7, verse 11. Now, if perfection came from the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to appear, said to be according to the order of Melchizedek, and not according to the order of Aaron? For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must be a change of law as well. For the one these things are spoken about belonged to a different tribe. No one from it has served at the altar. Now it is evident that the Lord came from Judah, and Moses said nothing about the tribe concerning priests. And this becomes clearer in another priest, like Melchizedek appears, who did not become a priest based on a legal regulation about physical descent, but based on the power of an indestructible life. For it has been testified, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So the previous command is annulled because it was weak and unprofitable, for the law perfected nothing, but a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. None of this happened without an oath, for others became priests without an oath, but he became a priest with an oath made by the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has also become the guarantee of a better covenant. Now many have become Levitical priests since they are prevented by death from remaining in office. But because he remains forever, he holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, since he always lives to intercede for them. For this is the kind of high priest we need: holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day, as high priests do, first for their own sins, then for those of the people. He did this once for all time when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the promise of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son who has been perfected forever. This is the word of God.
Quick survey of the room. Got a few questions for you. How many of you in here, and I'm saying use, not own, but how many of you in here use a home phone? Anybody? Okay, we got a few. All right, cool. Just curious about that. What about a CD player? I mean, use it. You have to use it, not just own it. All right, got it. Okay, there we go. That's vintage now, right? Is a CD player vintage? Maybe. No, doesn't count. DVD player we still use in our van just to keep the kids busy. But what about a tape deck? Anybody got that? Yeah, okay, now we're moving further. 8-track? Nobody, right? Okay, cool. VCR? Somebody got like some old VHS tapes? Okay, got a couple. Thought we might have some of those. All right, last question. Does anybody still have one of those old school like box TVs? Like, I don't mean like the plasma flat screen HD. I mean like that you use it? Don't use it much. All right, cool. So I'm not making fun of you in some of the illustration I'm about to use, okay? I'm sorry. So, because if I walk into your house and you have an old school tube TV, I'm going to be like, what are we doing, right? When it comes to any kind of technology, there is always something new replacing the old. So at first, when you have new technology introduced, the world is trying to figure out, like, is this a gimmick or will this thing have staying power? And sometimes it's a gimmick, and we're trying to figure this right now with like the metaverse, right, and virtual reality. We're like, is this just like a cool thing or will this stick, for the next 100 years or whatever? But for those things that come along that do have staying power, eventually that item becomes commonly available, and whatever it was that served that purpose before becomes obsolete. So let's talk about HD TVs for a second as an example. They've essentially made the old box TVs obsolete, except for maybe Peter, and then in a museum somewhere, right? That's the purpose they serve. If we do have them, it's because we think it's cool, right? But if you actually wanted to use a box TV to serve the purpose of watching sports or your favorite Netflix show, like literally you can't watch Netflix on it. And if you tried to, you would spend more money like trying to get devices and adapters and maintaining that than you would just going to buy like a $50 used HD TV somewhere on Facebook Marketplace. Right? The HDTV, the new, has superseded the old and made it obsolete. What is considered new now will also one day be obsolete, right? Like it's a rotating thing. My father, who's sitting right here, he would bring home used electronics sometimes, and as kids, we would complain. So he'd be like, this isn't like the newest thing out there. It wasn't cutting edge. And he would say, well, this was top of the line 10 years ago. And that became a running joke. So we joke about that all the time. This car was top of the line 10 years ago, or this computer or whatever. But it's true, like nothing stays relevant forever, right? We can't always predict what the next thing will be, but 250 years from now, HD TVs will be irrelevant. I don't know if everyone's gonna have like their own little VR headsets and you'll be like fully immersed in the world. They're already starting to like have it where you can sit courtside and watch an NBA game. You know, maybe that'll be available for everybody. Who knows, but there will be something that HD TVs will be irrelevant. And in our passage today, the preacher of Hebrews talks about something that has come along that has made the old way of doing things obsolete and irrelevant. But the difference is with this new thing that has come along that has replaced the old, this is more than just a new, shiny technological advancement that kind of tweaks the old way and then will eventually be tweaked itself and be replaced by the next thing. The thing that has appeared is a whole new way because the thing is a person and his name is Jesus. And because this person has what our text says is an indestructible life, it remains forever. When it comes to bringing humans in union with God, there is never another need for a future advancement. There will never be anything better than Jesus because the best has come. Good morning again, New Eden Church. For those of you who I've not had the privilege yet of meeting. My name is Joel, and I get to serve as one of the pastors here, specifically the pastor for preaching and oversight. And as always, it's a joy to gather with each of you as God's people. As we said last week on Easter Sunday, you know, like the big celebration of the church for the year. This is something we do every week. We gather to celebrate and fix our eyes on Jesus, the founder and finisher of our faith. And so that's what we're centered on and about. So as we typically do, we're preaching through a book of the Bible. We took a couple weeks off to spend some time in Luke during on both sides of Holy Week, but now we're back in the book of Hebrews, as you just heard read. Quick refresher, because we have been out of it a couple weeks. I think Hebrews is best digested for us as a homily or a short sermon. I say short, it's probably like 45, 50 minutes, but as a sermon that was given probably orally at first and then written and passed around to the churches at the time in the early church. The sole purpose of the book, as we've reminded ourselves every week, is to remind Christians about the truth that Jesus is better. He is the supremacy of Christ magnified. And so we're getting to this point in the book that our author or preacher or pastor, whatever you want to call him, has been kind of building to this like flood of focus and truth about who Christ is, the meat of the sermon, if you will. The old way, the former covenant, the previous system is being superseded by the all-saving glory of God as revealed for us in the face of Christ. Last time, you might remember a couple weeks ago when we were together, we looked at this mysterious figure, Melchizedek. And our preacher made the case that the order of Melchizedek was better than the old priestly order of Aaron, and that Jesus is the one that was pointing to. He's the true priest king who comes from the Melchizedek line, fulfilling everything that sinners need. And so today our text, after laying that foundation, will continue to show us this, that Jesus is better than the law. Let's read verses 11 and 12 again to see how the preacher starts his logical argument, and then we'll start breaking it down. He says, now if perfection came through the Levitical priesthood, so that's synonymous with the order of Aaron, if it came through that, for on the basis of it the people received the law, then what further need was there for another priest to appear, said to be according to the order of Melchizedek, and not according to the order of Aaron? This is important, for when there is a change of the priesthood, there must be a change of law as well. So the priesthood and the law are tied together. And the text starts by saying that logically, if perfection or completion could come through the Levitical priesthood, if that was the goal of that, then why would there be a need for another priest? So the fact that there is another priestly order proves to us that the old order is insufficient, and he specifically addresses this through the idea of the law throughout this short passage. He does unpack a little bit more about the priestly order. We've already spent time on that, so we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit and hone in on what is said about the law, and we're going to keep this passage simple and break it down in the form of two true statements that I have that form one big idea. So this is a big idea for our passage today. The law was weak, unprofitable, and incomplete, but Jesus is powerful, perfect, and permanent. This is our one big idea, and we're going to start by looking at the first half of this big idea, which if you're keeping notes, it's the first main point. The law was weak, unprofitable, and incomplete. The writer of Hebrews does not mince any words when it comes to his feelings about the law. These are his words: weak, unprofitable, holding no value, incomplete. He says that because of this, it's been annulled, it's been done away with, it's been divorced, so to speak. But what does he mean when he uses this term, the law? What would the original hearers have heard when they heard this term, the law? Because that can be muddied for us a little bit. So in this context, and in most contexts in the New Testament, the word law is specifically used to refer to what was called the Mosaic law. So this was the law that was given to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai shortly after they had been redeemed from the land of Egypt. And the law essentially functions as the terms of the covenant relationship that God is making with them. Probably the most common form is the Ten Commandments. It includes that, but it's not limited to that. There are a lot of laws, social guidelines, dietary laws, moral instruction, ways to relate to God through priests and sacrifices and rituals. And so this kind of whole system and whole setup that had been going on for years, that's what would have come to mind for our original hearers. And our author doesn't seem to think very highly of this Mosaic law. This was what they would have been tempted to fall back into. In verse 18, we're told that the law is annulled or done away with because it is weak. So what this means is that the Mosaic law was powerless when it came to perfecting people or making them whole. And the reality is the law was never intended to do that. It was this temporary thing given. It was never meant to make people whole. Union with God had always come through faith. And the way he talks about it, the law was never intended to do that. Humans are the ones that took something and tried to make it do something it wasn't meant to do. And things always go awry when that happens. When we bought this building, we did a lot of the renovations ourselves. I should say that Kevin, as I jokingly called him our pastor for construction, did a lot of the renovations, and a few of us tagged along and climbed up some ladders and messed some stuff up, and then he would come fix it. But one thing I quickly learned is that having the right tool for the job makes all the difference. Like I would look at a job and be like, how are we going to complete this? And I'm comparing it to like, I decided to do something a little bit construction based. By this, I mean like I have a block of wood for some reason, I'm doing something and it's like, I'm using these like cheap craftsman tools that somebody gave to me and I'm trying to make this happen and I'm like incredibly frustrated and exhausted. And it's like, I used to think things were difficult to do and then I realized I just didn't have the right tools. And like when you get the right tool that's powerful enough, that's meant for that job, it becomes a lot easier. At its best, the law can only serve as a mirror to reveal our need for help, but it does absolutely nothing as a tool in moving the needle toward bringing us into union with God. Nothing. The scriptures are clear. It is weak. And if you go to the law and ask it to save you, you will end up just as exhausted as if you try to take a 3-inch screw and try to nail it into a piece of wood with using a hammer. That's not what it's intended to do. It doesn't work. It just makes things worse. And that's often why we're exhausted. We're asking the law to make us whole, and it was never designed to do that. But not only does he say the law is weak, he also says it's unprofitable. It does not have redemptive or saving value. Now that Christ has arrived, it is meaningless. No value, empty, void, unprofitable, no merit. In the same way, you can't use monopoly money to go buy a mill. You cannot use the law to earn right standing with God. You can't take it here. That money's not welcome here. And the last thing our preacher says in verse 18 is that it perfects nothing. This idea of perfection, we've talked about this, but it's completeness, making whole. It could not complete anything. And here's the thing. Again, it was never meant to. Even in the Old Testament, there were always promises of the law being done away with, and that eventually it would be written on the hearts of God's people, not on tablets of stone. It could never bring humanity to the end goal, which was union with God, relationship. It is why those who choose to live under the law never experience wholeness and freedom, because it was never empowered to do that. There's always, if you live under the law, and you might have experienced this, I've experienced this. If you live under the law, there's always another sacrifice to offer. There's always a new rule to keep, another sin to confess, another penance to perform. There is never rest, freedom, and true transformation. And our author wants to make sure his hearers hear this loud and clear. The law was transient, weak, temporal, ineffective, and unprofitable. Now, as I said, the original hearers would have heard this and knew that he was specifically talking about the Mosaic law that they had lived under. It was their immediate temptation to run back to. It's why he's referencing this. But this doesn't mean, even though this passage was not written directly to us, it was written for us. And so this still serves as an instruction for us as Christians, even 2,000 years later, in the way that we relate to God. We might not live under the Mosaic law. We might not go make offerings in a temple. We might not be performing the ceremonial rituals. We might not bring an animal sacrifice because we think it'll make us closer to God's presence. But we would be ignorant if we thought that we do not try to relate to God through law keeping at times. Our own version of running back to the law might include things like believing that we are less loved by God because we have sinned that day, or we have been disobedient. Or thinking that when we do sin, we treat God maybe like our fathers were growing up, that we had to give them time to simmer down like other humans, right? Or our bosses or our teachers, whatever it was, our coaches. Like when we make a mistake, let's give them time to simmer down, and then we can go back and talk to them. Maybe read our Bible for a few days in a row, attend church, and then God will be like, all right, now you have my ear. Now we can talk again. Or maybe the inverse of that is thinking that we are more accepted by God because we've done a pretty good job keeping the rules recently. God's like really ready to listen because we just wrote that tithe check. So now we've got his ear, right? Like God's like, man, okay, we'll set these guys aside. This guy's doing pretty good today. Like that's how we envision our relationship with God. Or maybe we find ourselves believing that Christianity can be boiled down to a list of rules to follow, some laws to keep, some principles to live by. And that's the sum of what following Jesus is. And this is no more than just an instruction manual to tell you how to live your life. Holy Spirit power, don't need that. Got the rules, here we go. Or we might take our own preferences and turn them into a checklist of spiritual maturity or faithfulness. So mature Christians are those that live like I do, dress like I do, make the same schooling decisions for their kids like I do, have the same dating principles that I do, are passionate about the same cultural dangers that I am. And like the list could go on and on and on. And we begin to judge those around us based on how well they line up with us, not God. And we can add a litany of expectations, and they aren't always stated, because like we can't just come out and be like, hey, if you don't school your kids this way, then you're not as good of a Christian as I am. But like they can become unstated expectations that we place on those around us. And we add these on top of the work of Christ. Like we would never say, hey, we're setting that aside. We're like, hey, we need that, but plus this, and this. And even if we know in our heads, like all those examples, and I don't know what it is for you, I know what my struggles are, because I've got mine. Even if we know in our heads that we shouldn't we shouldn't do those things, because we know the gospel, we've heard it preached enough, we know that it's Jesus plus nothing equals everything, right? So we know that, but then we still find ourselves like tensing up a little bit when somebody proclaims the free message of grace. Like we got to always add in like a yes, but this. because we're scared that maybe the truth is just a little too radical. And if we don't just like take God's grace and just sprinkle in just a little bit of the law, then won't people take advantage of God's grace? And I see this, I feel it sometimes in my own heart. I'm like, I don't know, like aren't people gonna take advantage of this? But like what's crazy about Paul, like if you're not preaching the radical message of grace so much that every now and then you gotta be like, hey, but I'm not saying you just have a license to sin. Because like Paul had to say that. But the reason he had to say that was because it was like this flood of grace. Like he's just like radically doing that. And I see where Christians and pastors, myself included, we get scared sometimes that the message of grace might not be enough. And so we find ways to finagle the law into our message, mix it in just a little bit enough so people are restrained. But it never works. It produces two things, shame and pride in our hearts. And I've been there, where I'm on this roller coaster. Or one day I'm just full of shame and guilt because I'm not measuring up. And the next day I'm walking around like I'm the best thing on earth because I kept the law. Somehow we think that, yeah, it might have been abundant, overflowing, free grace that transformed my heart, but others might need the strong arm of the law. And I want to be clear. Let me go with the Paul disclaimer. There's nothing wrong with obedience from a transformed heart. And the law can be an incredible mirror to where our heart is. But principles and rules and laws are ineffective, weak, and powerless when it comes to changing and saving you. The best they can do is reveal that there's a problem. They can't even bring you to a place where you're willing to admit that there's a problem and bring you to repentance. The scriptures are clear that it is the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. Not only here in Hebrews, but all throughout the scriptures, it's clear the law can't save us, can't justify us, can't sanctify us, can't glorify us. I'm going to read a few for you. Romans 10:4, Paul says, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." The end, the means, the goal, it's done. Galatians 2:16, we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Later in Galatians chapter 3, listen to his flow of argument. If the law had been granted with the ability to give life, then righteousness would certainly be on the basis of the law. If that was the goal of the law, was to give life, then yeah, of course. But the scriptures imprisoned everything under sin's power so that the promise might be given on the basis of faith in Jesus Christ to those who believe. Now, before this faith came, yes, we were confined under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith was revealed. The law then was our guardian until Christ, so that we could be justified by faith. But since that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian, for through faith you are all sons of God in Christ Jesus. And he goes on to say that those who want to live under the law are not living as sons, but as slaves. He says, you who want to live under the law, do you hear its demands? Are you listening? Why would we want to go back there? Why would we choose slavery over sonship? And he literally tells them, drive out the law. Using a pretty crude illustration, you can read it later. He's drive out the law. He says, I would that you would stand firm and don't submit to the yoke of slavery. I think most time we hear stand firm, we're like, stand firm on like these rules and the law. And that's how we interpret it. He's like, no, stand firm against that. Stand firm. Don't go to the yoke of slavery. So we're not going to tiptoe around biblical truth. The law has been fulfilled in Christ. And the only time we see the law spoken about is when it's totally transformed into the law of liberty or the law of love. That's Paul like redefining this language radically. And this is actually good news. Because the reality is, for those who want to live under the law, we can never measure up. Now, you might be able to keep your own watered down version of God's law. We can pretend, we can put on the mask. But the reality is, when we are exposed, none of us are good enough, disciplined enough, or consistent enough. It doesn't matter what people on the outside look in and think. We know it. And on the basis of scriptural authority, if you failed in one point of the law, you failed in all. So we're all there. We're all in the same boat. And God knew this. Like, that's why the law was always meant to be replaced. replaced by one who is both the lawgiver and the law fulfiller. And what's interesting about this is like intertwined with conversations about the law, what we see is a lot about the old priesthood. And this is why. Priests were given, embedded in the law to intercede and act on behalf of the people when they failed to keep the law. So literally, like we don't think about this, but literally embedded in the law are allowances for when it's not kept. Like God knows the human heart. So like even as he's given the law, he's like, hey, let me help you out though. Because when you fail here, here's what we can do. When you fail to keep the terms of the covenant, here's how I'm still gonna pursue you. The law itself is evidence that it can't change hearts and fix the problems. It's like the law standing there. It's like, stop trying to use me for that. Stop. That's not what I'm designed to do. It was always pointing forward to a better priest who would be so good at his job that the law would become irrelevant. And this faithful permanent priest is Jesus, which leads us to the second half of our big idea and our last point. The law was weak, unprofitable, and incomplete, but Jesus is powerful, perfect, and permanent. Almost had my big idea be the law was weak, unprofitable, and incomplete, but Jesus is the GOAT. But I didn't know if everybody would get that, so I figured I'd go with powerful, perfect, and permanent. Some great alliteration. It's all about Jesus. All throughout our text today, the author just floods us with how Christ is better than the old priesthood. And this truth is what does away with our need for the law. So in verses 12 to 14, he makes it clear that it was always the plan. The old priesthood was always just a shadow of Christ's work that has been foreordained since the foundations of the world. In verse 16, we're told that the old order had priests who held their authority on the basis of the law or legal regulation. So those priests were put in place because of the law. But Jesus, apart from the law, holds his priesthood based on, I love this language, the power of an indestructible life. Like just by the sheer fact that he can't be destroyed. Like he says he's the priest, so he is. Who's going to take it away? Death tried, didn't work. He's indestructible, so he is who he is. In verse 20 to 22, we're told that this priesthood, unlike the old order, is backed by an oath. Kevin preached on the promises of God through Hebrews a few weeks ago. You can go back and listen to that. But the idea here is that these priests weren't permanent. This priestly role is based on covenant promises, not just a temporal law. And since this is true, Jesus serves as the guarantee or the deposit or the down payment for a new covenant, which we're going to look at closer in a couple of weeks. In verses 23 to 25, we're told that under the old order, there were multiple priests. You see just these comparisons all throughout this passage. There were multiple priests because they kept dying. Even the best priest for Israel could not beat death. But because he remains forever, because he beat the grave, Jesus is able to save us completely. As some translations say, to the uttermost. All encompassing every part of us, our whole being, and for eternity. And then in verses 26 through 28, we're hit with this final flood of truth about who Jesus is. And I'm going to read it for us one more time, just because it's incredible. He says, "For this is the kind of high priest we need, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens." He doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day, as high priests do. First for their own sins, then for those of the people. He, this new high priest, Jesus, did this once for all time when he offered, plot twist, himself. For the law appoints as high priest men who are weak, but the promise of the oath which came after the law appoints a son who has been perfected forever. And I love this because in Hebrews, we see both the humanity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. We've seen how he is the high priest who becomes flesh and experiences our weaknesses and takes that flesh on. He's empathetic, but here we see this like flood of Jesus as truly divine, holy, innocent, set apart, exalted as God's son. And because he is God, he doesn't need to offer sacrifices continually. And the plot twist comes at the end of verse 27 when the priest himself, the image is that the priest would normally offer an animal sacrifice. This wasn't expected, but this priest is the one who himself climbs up on the altar and offers himself. And he ends the old priesthood when he does this. With his life, he was the perfect sacrifice who could both eat with sinners intimately, yet not become unclean because he is holy and undefiled. And he offers up his life as the perfect and holy offering to atone for our sin, our substitution. He takes our place. And this work is final and complete. It's what the cross is all about. It is doing away with the need for continued rituals and offerings. When Jesus crawled up on the old rugged cross, offering up himself once and for all for the sins of the world, he was bodying the old order of the law. He was posterizing it. He was ending it. He was making it irrelevant. That's why he says, "It is finished." The veil is torn in two. No more need for it. It's done. And when we try to run back to the old way, because that is our tendency, that is my tendency, we are all legalist at heart because we want to be in control and we want the credit. But when we do that, we're essentially saying that Christ's crawling on the cross wasn't enough. There's more to be done. We got to kind of help him out a little bit or something. He didn't do enough. And we're trampling on the blood of Christ and his finished work. We are running to something that is weak and powerless and ineffective. And it's why if we choose to live under the law, we can be as sincere as we want and passionate as we want in our desire to live righteously. Because a lot of times that's where it starts. But what happens is we end up more frustrated and tired than we were before. Because the problem is not you keeping more rules, it's that you're dead and you got a heart of stone. It has to be ripped out and replaced with a heart of flesh, and the law can't make dead things live. The law can maybe put some makeup on a dead corpse, but it can't cause it to come to life and breathe and beat with the heartbeat of God because we're united to him. That takes resurrection power. But there is one who has the power of an indestructible life. And he takes our body of sin into the grave with them. And he resurrects with us out of the grave a new life with a new heart that somehow, I can't even explain it, but somehow actually desires to know God, to follow in obedience. I'm saying, this isn't me. Somebody wants to give me credit. There's no good in me apart from Christ. He made me live. He made my heart beat again. And the cross and resurrection of Jesus is the final proof that the law is now obsolete. He is victor over all the powers of darkness. He has claimed his rightful position, exalted in the heavens on the basis of an indestructible life. Hell threw to Jesus its worst, and it didn't make a dent. And this is good news, because he invites you into this journey. This is free grace that is open to all. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you've done. I don't care if you're the worst legalist in here or the most licentious. This offer is welcome to you. Because, and I believe this is biblical, but each individual life takes on the shape of human history. Just as we've kind of seen today, and I didn't have time to go into all the details, but humanity as a whole once lived under the law. In the same way, each of us find ourselves at some point in our lives keenly aware of our sin and our brokenness, and we are crushed underneath the weight of the fact that we don't measure up. You might not use language of the law. I don't know what it is for you, but at some point, maybe it's on your journey as a spouse, maybe it's your journey as a single person, maybe it's your journey as a parent, as a child, but you're like, I'm not enough, and you're crushed. And our destination is death as a result. The law crushes us under its weight. It is the taskmaster that reveals our inadequacies. Paul explores this idea in Romans 7. He says, the law comes and we die because we're aware of our sin. And you know how he ends the chapter? Not with saying, so let me give you some better rules to follow. He's actually like, hey, I try to do things and I don't try to do things and I do. And he ends by saying, oh, wretched man that I am. Who can save me? Where's the hope? And he says, thanks be to God. It is it. He is our only hope. And so the question becomes, the invitation to us, when we are crushed under the law, and when we become so aware of our own inadequacies, how will we respond? We can either tighten the law and try to have more discipline and just white knuckle it a little bit harder and a little bit more. Or maybe we can relax the law and create a new law to live under. Get rid of God's law and his design for our lives, and we're just going to live the way we want to live. Or we can run with boldness to a throne that is drenched in the grace of Jesus, just waiting for us to receive it. See, the only answer we have, the only solution to the problems we face is the radical and free good news of Jesus, what you hear us say when we say the gospel, his life, death, burial, and resurrection. And so if you've never received Christ, if today you find yourself crushed by the weight of the law, please don't just set it aside and then turn around back into it and enter this vicious cycle. Draw near to God through the finished work of Christ. He stands with arms open, ready to save you. And for those of us who have received this free grace and your justification is secure, I celebrate with you, but together I implore you, may we not run back to the law. How did you start this journey? Grace alone. How will you be sustained on this journey? Grace alone. How will you finish this journey? Grace alone. You can't start by the Spirit and then run back to the flesh. So may we together, because we need each other, this is a communal call. May we stand firm in our freedom. The law is obsolete. Let it go. Don't try to hang on to it. Don't try to mix it with the gospel. Something better has come. And that something is Jesus. In close, I'll leave you with this poem. To run and work, the law commands, yet gives me neither feet nor hands. But better news the gospel brings. It bids me fly and gives me